Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Happy Net Zero Day. It's a historic day today. You know, this is the first major economy in the world to say we're not just going to reduce our emissions, we're going to end our emissions. We're going to get our emissions to zero. We're going to end our contribution to global warming, and we're going to do it by 2050. We've been doing a bit of a net zero roadshow, a festival from CCC the last few weeks, and it's been amazing to see the enthusiasm for this target, the real desire for this from business. So it's great to come to a summit like this and get to talk about it and put a bit of flesh on the bones, hopefully. So thank you very much for having me. Really looking forward to hopefully a bit of discussion at the end if we can squeeze it in. Right, can I click? Yes, right. 2050 is now only just over 30 years away. 30 years, 6 months to go, 18 days as well from today. To borrow a phrase from the Brexit debate, let's not waste it. There is an awful lot that we need to do, and we need to get on with this tomorrow. Today is Net Zero Day. Tomorrow is time to start getting the policies in place. So I'm going to talk about what the target is, why we recommended that was the level for the target, why that's right for the UK, and then very briefly, because there's 300-page reports behind this, how we think we can actually get there. So the what first. It's net zero, it's all greenhouse gases, it covers the whole of the economy, all of those emissions getting to zero by 2050. And we're very clear the plan should be to do this in the UK. We shouldn't be looking to outsource this, buying international credits. They might have a role at the margin if other things don't go how we expect, but we should be aiming to do this absolutely in the UK. And the key thing in this report, headline message on the first page of the report, the target is nothing without the policies to back it. This will not happen just from the goodwill of British people and British businesses. This needs to be backed by government policy providing the direction. And actually, the Climate Change Act requires that. You don't just set a 2050 target in the Climate Change Act. You set a target, you have carbon budgets on the way to it, and you have to legislatively bring forward the policies to meet it. So that's what it is, and we have different targets for Wales and Scotland that reflect their different capabilities, and those have both also been adopted. Wales yesterday, Scotland actually at 2 minutes past midnight on the day that we gave the advice. So in terms of why, well, the obvious first starting point here is because the climate is changing. We can all see that looking around us. We know that this is happening. This is no longer an issue for the future. This is here, this is now. We can see it around us across the world in the extreme weather events, in the flooding, in the droughts, in the heat waves that we are seeing. And it will not stop until we stop our emissions. So if we want to stop global warming, we do. It's in the UK's interests. We need emissions globally to get to zero. And the UK has to play its role in that. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Oh. Right, and so I want to talk just about how the UK fits then within the world. And we very much approach this question in the CCC as what action should the UK do to best give a chance of moving the world? This is not just about our actions, this is about a global effort to tackle climate change. And you've got on the left here, this is the IPCC scenarios for what the world needs to do to stay well below 2 degrees, that's the blue, or to stay below 1.5 degrees, that's the red. And people are quite familiar with the 2050 date on here. This is the world needs to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050. What we're talking about in the UK is the picture on the right, if I can make it appear. All greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, methane as well, nitrous oxide, and the fluorinated gases as well. All of those we're saying in the UK should be zero by 2050. So actually on that basis, we're about 20 years ahead of when the IPCC say the world needs to do this for a 1.5 degree target. We think it's right for the UK to be ahead. We think you don't want to be too far ahead, but to be in the pack of leading countries, which is where this puts us. Other countries are thinking about the same sort of target. France, the European Union have the same thing on the table at the moment. We think that's the right thing to do. It reflects that we have very high historical emissions by international standards. We've just gone 18 days without burning coal, but we've been doing it pretty much continuously since the 1800s. We have a big global carbon footprint, so we import a lot of emissions in the goods that we bring in from other countries. And of course, we're a wealthy country. We have the capability to do this, and we have strong legislative backing in the Climate Change Act. We have a public that wants to do something on this. We're well positioned to help lead that global effort as well. And finally, we think it really matters. It really matters what the UK does here, because our influence does go beyond our borders. What we do can help to develop the technologies, the business models, the policies that then need to be deployed in other countries. And also just showing that this can be done, showing you can run your power system without coal on it, counts for an awful lot from a country like the UK that is recognised as having that history that we have. And I just want to do one more slide on the international picture. This is now in per capita terms. So you see a slightly less scary turnaround in terms of what we need to achieve here. We still need to cut very rapidly, something that has not been falling through kind of all of the records that we've got. But if we overlay the UK on that, we've been showing what can be done. You know, this is the example of why what the UK does matters. We are now at the global average level of emissions per person. We have been reducing it at roughly the rate we need to do. We need to accelerate, but not by that much. And if we can keep going down then on that red line, it really is a powerful example to others to then adopt a similar sort of target, do a similar sort of thing. And the great news in our report is that we can do it without stopping living our lives, without a huge burden to the economy, and whilst providing opportunities for business to grasp. So on to the how, and I'm going to race through this. There's a lot of this. As I say, there's 300-page reports behind this. We've made progress in the power sector, but clearly all of that needs to switch to being low carbon. We also need to do stuff about all of the end uses, so homes, vehicles, industry, shipping, aviation, the lot. So we need twice as much low carbon, twice as much power, 4 times as much low carbon power in the end. That then can help us to decarbonise some of these other sectors. Alongside that, we think we'll need a big hydrogen industry. Of course, that has to be a green industry, it has to be low carbon hydrogen, and actually we'll need an awful lot of it. We think roughly a similar level to the amount of electricity that we have today in one of the scenarios that we've shown. That can help to reach some of the tougher bits that aren't that suited to electrification. You're still left with other bits left over, so you probably will need carbon capture, well, you will need carbon capture and storage alongside it for those things you can't electrify and that aren't that well suited to hydrogen. But you're still left with bits you can't deal with, aviation being a key one. We don't have a low carbon plane or an answer to flying without carbon emissions yet. And so we need to do other things to compensate for aviation and for those other really difficult sectors to reduce emissions. The key to that then is the land sector, and this is a big change in going from 80% to 100% target, is that the land sector becomes really important. We have to be taking CO2 actively out of the atmosphere in order to offset, to compensate for those emissions that we can't get rid of. That means planting an awful lot of trees, it means growing an awful lot of biomass, and it probably means using that in combination with carbon capture and storage in order to sequester those emissions for the very long term. Even this is not quite enough to get you there. So you will probably also need some things on the demand side with things like aviation, things like the really hard to treat bits of industry, stop using some of those products, stop flying as much as we otherwise would have done. So that roughly is it. Few things to say about this. It's hard. There is an awful lot to do here. 30 years is not a long time for this sort of transformation. Comes back to the point at the beginning, we need to get on with it now. Secondly, this is all very integrated. We've got lots of vectors that are cutting across each other, power producing hydrogen, hydrogen producing power, each of those being used in different types of vehicle, etc. It's a complicated picture, and so the government policy needs to be joined up on this. This cannot be transport does this, BEIS does that, DEFRA does this. This has to be a genuinely cross-government approach, and it has to cover all levels of government as well. Third, this has to involve people. This is no longer just we switch out the electricity supply, you turn on your light and it still comes on. We're going into people's homes, we're changing the cars that they need to drive. People will need to be at the centre of this. And it goes along with that place will matter as well. The solutions in different places will be different because of the infrastructure that will have to go with this, because of the different democratic mandate that might come in one area versus another. So we need to involve people, we need to involve places. But the key thing I think really with this is just that It's hard, and we need to get on with it now. So that's kind of the final thing I want to say on that. The last slide then is about cost. People may have seen the £1 trillion number that was in the FT that came from the Treasury. I mean, if you add up numbers over a lot of years and you compare them to GDP, 1 to 2% of GDP now is 20 to 40 billion pounds a year. That's what roughly we think the cost is. Multiply that over 30 years, you get to £1 trillion. You know, it is a large number, and it's important to be clear about that there is potentially quite a high cost here. But it is a potential cost because there's an amazing innovation story over the time that we've had here. We've switched from an 80% target to a 100% target now. Before that, we had a 60% target. Each time we thought this would cost around 1 to 2% of GDP. As innovation has brought technology costs down, so we've been able to go further within the same cost envelope that we had already. Every reason to think that that could happen again. We haven't assumed it. We've been clear that there could be a cost here of this sort of order, but if we can have the same sort of progress that we've seen in the last decade, in the next decade, the decade after that, every reason to think you could deliver this actually as a net positive to the economy. Some of the things, electric cars, onshore wind, are already cheaper than the high carbon alternative. We could see that story play out across the economy as well. And this number doesn't even include any of the co-benefits. It doesn't include the air quality benefit. It doesn't include the noise benefit, the greener spaces and the better quality of life that can go with this. Those could easily add up to a similar sort of value, actually. It doesn't include the clean growth opportunity. So the fact that the future is low carbon, not just in the UK, but around the world, and businesses switching to that, they have the opportunity then to grow more rapidly than if we don't make the switch. And then finally, innovation. This is the one I want to finish on, really. We have been quite cautious about innovation. We haven't assumed that we see the rates of the last decade repeated in the future. And we haven't assumed that the clarity of a net zero target makes a real difference. But we think it can. You know, there's not much clearer than saying everything has to be zero now. Everything has to be low carbon. It's no longer most things. Everything has to be zero carbon. If you don't have a plan for your business to fit within a net zero world, you don't have a serious plan for the future. That has the potential to really push innovation. And we are confident that that innovation, which is not just technology, it's also business models, it's service offerings, it's consumer engagement. We're confident that with this target, with the right government policies to back it, we're confident that the businesses that are out there can come out and innovate and make this not just a cleaner world, but a better world in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know we started late, but obviously we had the 10 minutes allotted. I'm going to jump straight into the most popular question, and if you can, let's have a look. Okay. With that R remark, can you give quite a punctual answer in maybe a minute or so what your thoughts are? And then obviously, hopefully you'll maybe sticking around and answer some more questions after the session.
I think this is one of those areas where it's a grey area. You know, do you have international offsetting or don't you? I mean, the key thing that we have said is that we shouldn't plan for it. We haven't actually said that you should absolutely rule it out. We don't think there isn't really actually a legal mechanism now to say we won't have it. So in a sense, I don't mind the government keeping it on the table, but they shouldn't plan to use it. And as long as the reaction now to setting the net zero target is to put in place the policies in order to deliver this in the UK, if we find that some of those fall a bit short and we find that actually there is a positive, relatively low-cost market out there for international offsetting, a bit of offsetting at the margin would be okay. I think that is a realistic way of approaching this. But the key is that the plans aren't that. You can't plan to buy credits in the future when we don't know what the international credit market will look like, we don't know how expensive they will be. And the context for that is, if every country is acting, and our goal has to be to persuade every country to act, there is not going to be a pool of very cheap credits out there. There are going to be expensive credits. There may be some things that turn out to be cheaper elsewhere than in the UK, but planning for that now is not a sensible place to go.
Thank you so much. And thank you for saying Happy Net Zero Day. I think we can lead with that. For the people out there on Twitter, let's get it trending. Can you please join me in thanking Mike for sharing those insights?